I didn't expect to find my truck's windshield spiderwebbed into pieces on an ordinary Saturday morning, but the real shock was when the security camera revealed who did it. The coffee mug slipped from my fingers, shattering against the driveway. Concrete, with a sound that seemed to echo the destruction before me. Steam rose from the spreading brown puddle, mixing with the morning dew and fragments of automotive glass that caught the early sunlight like scattered diamonds of rage. My truck, my reliable, understated gray pickup, sat violated in my own driveway. The windshield looked like a frozen spider's web, each crack telling a story of deliberate violence. Deep gouges ran along the driver's side door, spelling out words I won't repeat here, carved with the precision of someone who took their time, someone who savored each scratch. The acrid smell of spray paint hung in the air. Bright orange letters screamed across my hood. "Move your truck or else!" The paint was still wet enough to drip, leaving orange tears down the sides of what had been pristine gray metal just hours before. My neighbor's windows remained dark and closed, as if the entire street was holding its breath. In suburbia, you learn to hear everything while seeing nothing. And this morning, that selective blindness felt heavier than usual. Someone had spent considerable time destroying my vehicle, and not a single porch light had flickered on. I walked around the truck slowly, my bare feet crunching on glass. The damage was methodical, personal. This wasn't random vandalism or a teenage prank. Someone had studied this truck, planned this attack, and executed it with the cold precision of someone settling a score. The irony wasn't lost on me. If they only knew what kind of score they'd just started. My phone buzzed against my palm as I photographed the damage from every angle. The insurance company would need documentation, but more importantly, I needed evidence. In my line of work, you learn that details matter, that the angle of a scratch or the pattern of shattered glass can tell you everything about who, what, when, and why. I pulled up my security camera app, fingers trembling with a mixture of rage and anticipation. The motion sensors had triggered at 2:47 a.m. I scrolled back, watching the timestamp tick backward through the peaceful hours of the night until there. A figure emerged from the shadows between houses, moving with the confident stride of someone who belonged in this neighborhood. They wore dark clothing and a baseball cap pulled low, but their gait was familiar. Too familiar. As the figure approached my truck, they paused and looked directly up at my security camera. For 3 full seconds, they stood there, as if daring the lens to capture what came next. Then they reached up and pulled off the baseball cap. My breath caught in my throat. Shoulder-length blonde hair spilled out, catching the streetlight like spun gold. She shook her head with theatrical flourish, as if she were revealing herself to an audience of thousands instead of a single security camera. Karen Mitchell, HOA Board President, self-appointed Neighborhood Watch Commander, the woman who'd made my life a bureaucratic hell for the past 18 months. She smiled directly at the camera, not a grin of madness, but the satisfied smirk of someone who'd finally taken action. Then she reached into her designer purse and withdrew a baseball bat. What followed was 10 minutes of methodical destruction. She started with the windshield, each swing deliberate and measured. The sound of aluminum connecting with safety glass echoed through the silent street like gunshots. She paused between swings, adjusting her stance like a batter perfecting their form. The side mirrors came next. Pop. Pop. Plastic and glass scattered across my driveway like confetti at the world's worst celebration. Then came the paint. She'd brought 3 cans, orange, black, and red, turning my truck into her personal canvas of rage. Each letter was carefully formed, each word strategically placed for maximum visual impact. But it was what she did at the end that made my blood run cold. She walked to the driver's side window and pressed a folded piece of paper against the glass, securing it with tape. Then she stepped back, admired her work like an artist at a gallery, and pulled out her phone to take photos. She was documenting her own crime. After pocketing her phone, she gave my security camera a little wave, the kind of cheerful goodbye you'd give to a friend, and disappeared back into the shadows between houses. I watched the timestamp tick forward to 2:58 a.m. 11 minutes. 11 minutes to transform my vehicle from transportation into a declaration of war. But Karen Mitchell had made one crucial miscalculation. She thought she was vandalizing the personal vehicle of just another neighbor who'd refused to bow to her HOA tyranny. She had no idea that my personal truck was actually an unmarked state police task force vehicle, equipped with tracking devices, surveillance equipment, and protected under federal law. She thought she was sending a message to a powerless suburbanite. Instead, she just committed multiple felonies against state property, all recorded in high-definition video, while leaving enough physical evidence to fill a prosecutor's wet dreams. I walked to the driver's side and carefully peeled away her note. The paper was expensive, the kind with her monogrammed initials embossed in gold at the top. Even in vandalism, Karen maintained her standards. The message was written in her distinctive handwriting, all flowing cursive and practiced elegance. This is what happens to people who don't respect community standards. Move your eyesore truck or face the consequences. The neighborhood is watching. KM. She'd signed her threat, with her initials, on her personal stationery. I looked up at my security camera and smiled the same way she had 11 minutes earlier. But my smile held a different kind of satisfaction. Karen Mitchell thought she was the predator in this story. She had no idea she'd just painted a target on herself for someone who hunted much more dangerous prey for a living. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the glass fragments at my feet until they sparkled like promises. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. "Rodriguez," came the gruff voice after 2 rings. "It's Thompson. I need to file a report for vandalism of state property." "Jesus! What happened?" "Someone just declared war on the wrong neighbor." As I waited for the crime scene unit, I looked at Karen's house across the street. Her bedroom light was on now, and I could see her silhouette moving behind sheer curtains. She was probably watching, waiting to see my reaction to her handiwork. She thought she was in control of this story. She thought she'd won. What she didn't realize was that she'd just handed me everything I needed to end her reign of suburban terror forever. The security footage, the signed confession, the federal crimes. It was all there, wrapped up with a bow like an early Christmas present. But I wasn't going to rush to unwrap it. Karen Mitchell had spent months making my life miserable with her petty power plays and bureaucratic bullying. She deserved to experience the full weight of consequences, delivered slowly and methodically. She wanted to play games with someone she thought was powerless. It was time to show her what happened when you picked the wrong opponent. The storm she'd unleashed was just beginning, and she was standing directly in its path. People always ask how these HOA wars begin. The truth: they don't start with fire. They start with sparks. 18 months earlier, I'd pulled into the driveway of 247 Maple Grove Lane with nothing but optimism and a moving truck full of dreams. The house was perfect, a 3-bedroom colonial with mature oak trees and a 2-car garage that would fit my truck with room to spare. The neighborhood looked like something from a Norman Rockwell painting. Manicured lawns, white picket fences, children's bicycles parked carelessly on sidewalks. What I didn't know was that I'd just moved into Karen Mitchell's kingdom. The first sign of trouble came disguised as a welcome basket. I was unpacking boxes in my garage when I heard the click of high heels on my driveway. Through the open garage door, I saw her approach, a woman in her early 50s with salon-perfect blonde hair, wearing a white tennis outfit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She carried a wicker basket wrapped in cellophane and tied with a bow that matched her lipstick. "You must be our new neighbor," she called out, her voice carrying that particular brand of enthusiasm that sounds genuine until you realize it's been focus grouped for maximum suburban appeal. "I'm Karen Mitchell, HOA President and Neighborhood UB Welcome Committee." I wiped the sweat from my forehead and walked over to greet her. "Nice to meet you. I'm Jake Thompson." She handed me the basket with a smile that belonged in a toothpaste commercial. "Just a little something to welcome you to our community. We pride ourselves on maintaining the highest standards here in Maple Grove." Inside the basket, a bottle of wine, some fancy crackers, a small potted plant, and, tucked discreetly beneath the ribbon, a thick booklet titled Maple Grove HOA Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions. "Light reading," I joked, thumbing through the booklet. Her laugh sounded like wind chimes in a hurricane. "Oh, that's just our little rule book. Nothing too complicated, just guidelines to help everyone maintain property values and community standards." The booklet was 47 pages long. "Most of it's common sense," she continued, her eyes scanning my garage with the intensity of a building inspector. "Keep your lawn trimmed. Park in your driveway. No commercial vehicles. That sort of thing." That's when her gaze landed on my truck. It was parked in my driveway, exactly where a truck should be parked. But I watched her expression shift almost imperceptibly, the smile tightening at the corners, her head tilting like a bird studying prey. "That's quite a substantial vehicle," she said, her tone remaining cheerful, while her eyes calculated dimensions and violations. "It's just a pickup truck," I replied. "Gray F-150, pretty standard." What I didn't mention was that it wasn't standard at all. The truck looked ordinary enough from the outside, no police markings, no obvious modifications. But underneath that, civilian exterior sat thousands of dollars worth of law enforcement equipment. Encrypted radio systems, GPS tracking, reinforced doors, bulletproof glass, and a sophisticated surveillance package that could record conversations from 100 yards away. To Karen Mitchell, it was just an oversized truck that might violate her aesthetic sensibilities. To the State Police Task Force, it was Mobile Command Unit 7. "Well," she said, her smile returning to full wattage, "I'm sure you'll find our community guidelines very reasonable. We've worked so hard to create something special here." Over the following weeks, I began to understand what something special meant in Karen's vocabulary. It meant Joan Henderson getting a violation notice because her roses grew 2 inches over the property line. It meant the Nguyen family being fined for parking their Honda Civic improperly in their own driveway. Apparently, it was angled at 23 degrees instead of the required 25. It meant elderly Mr. Peterson receiving threatening letters about his lawn height while recovering from hip surgery. Karen ruled Maple Grove with the iron fist of someone who'd found purpose in powerlessness. She'd transformed a homeowners association from a practical necessity into a personal fiefdom, complete with subjects who paid tribute in the form of fines and submission. Most neighbors had learned to live with it. They trimmed their hedges to exact specifications, painted their shutters in pre-approved colors, and attended monthly HOA meetings where they sat in silence while Karen held court. I wasn't most neighbors. My first violation notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, printed on expensive letterhead, and delivered in an envelope marked Urgent HOA Compliance Issue. Dear Mr. Thompson, during our routine community inspection, we observed that your lawn height exceeds the maximum allowable 2.5 inches as specified in CCNR Section 4.2a. Please remedy this violation within 72 hours or face additional fines. Additionally, your truck appears to extend beyond the acceptable driveway boundaries. Please review Section 6.1c regarding proper parking procedures. We appreciate your prompt attention to these matters. Sincerely, Karen Mitchell, HOA President. I walked outside and measured my grass with a ruler. 2 3/4 inches. I was off by a 1/4 inch. My truck sat squarely in the center of my driveway, exactly where trucks belong. That evening, I knocked on Karen's door. She answered wearing a silk blouse and pearls, as if she'd been expecting a photographer instead of a neighbor. Jake, how nice. I trust you received our notice? I did. I'm a little confused about the measurements. Her smile remained perfect. Oh, I'm sure it's just a simple oversight. These things happen when people aren't used to maintaining community standards. My grass is 2.75 inches. Your notice says the limit is 2.5. Exactly. A 1/4 inch might not seem like much to you, but rules exist for a reason. And my truck? Well, it's quite large, isn't it? Some neighbors have expressed concerns. I looked around her perfect living room, taking in the white furniture, the spotless surfaces, the complete absence of anything that suggested actual human habitation. Which neighbors? Oh, I don't like to name names, but several people have mentioned that it's not quite in keeping with our community aesthetic. That's when I realized what I was dealing with. Karen Mitchell didn't care about grass height or parking angles or community standards. She cared about control. She'd created a system where she could exercise power over people who couldn't fight back. But I could fight back. I just chose not to. Yet. I'll take care of the grass, I said. Wonderful. I'm so glad we could resolve this amicably. Over the following months, the notices kept coming. My mailbox became a regular stop on Karen's violation tour. Grass too long, truck parked at the wrong angle, garden hose left visible from the street, basketball hoop allegedly creating noise pollution. Each notice was hand-delivered, each violation photographed for her files, each interaction documented with the thoroughness of someone building a case. What Karen didn't know was that I was building a case, too. Every interaction was recorded by the surveillance equipment hidden throughout my property. Every violation notice was scanned and filed in a database that tracked patterns of harassment. Every neighbor she'd targeted was quietly interviewed and their experiences documented. By day, I investigated real criminals, drug dealers, human traffickers, organized crime syndicates. By night, I came home to deal with Karen Mitchell, a different kind of predator who fed on the powerlessness of suburban compliance. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years learning to identify bullies, manipulators, and petty tyrants. I could spot psychological patterns from a mile away, could predict behavioral escalations, could build airtight cases that sent dangerous people to prison. But in my own neighborhood, I was just another victim of HOA tyranny. Until the night she smashed my truck. Karen Mitchell thought she was teaching a lesson to a powerless neighbor. She thought she was demonstrating what happened when someone refused to bow to her authority. What she actually did was cross a line she didn't even know existed. Because my truck wasn't just my truck, it was state property. And vandalism of state property wasn't an HOA matter. It was a federal crime. For 18 months, I'd played by her rules, paid her fines, and endured her power trips because I wanted to be a good neighbor. But good neighbors don't smash other people's property with baseball bats, and they definitely don't do it to the wrong person. The war Karen started with that first violation notice was about to reach its inevitable conclusion. She'd spent months trying to break me down with petty bureaucracy and suburban psychological warfare. It was time to show her what real power looked like. The smashed windshield wasn't the first shot, it was the loudest. The escalation began 3 months after my first violation notice, on a Tuesday evening that started peacefully and ended with me questioning whether suburban warfare was more exhausting than actual combat. I was grilling burgers in my backyard when I heard the unmistakable click of Karen's heels on my front sidewalk. By now, I'd learned to recognize that sound the way soldiers recognize incoming artillery. It meant trouble was about to knock on my door. But this time, she didn't knock. Instead, she walked directly into my backyard through the side gate, uninvited and unannounced, carrying her phone and what appeared to be a measuring tape. "Mr. Thompson," she called out, her voice cutting through the evening air like a smoke alarm. "I need to document another violation." I looked up from my grill, spatula in hand, trying to process the audacity of someone walking uninvited into my private space. "Excuse me?" "Your fence," she said, pointing at the 6-foot privacy fence I'd installed the month before. "I've received complaints that it exceeds the height restrictions outlined in our CCNRs." She was already measuring, her phone camera capturing every inch as if she were documenting a crime scene. The scent of her perfume, something expensive and cloying, mixed with the smell of charcoal and summer evening air, creating an olfactory cocktail that made my stomach turn. "The permit I pulled specified 6 feet, I said, keeping my voice level. "That's within HOA guidelines. Guidelines can be interpreted differently depending on the circumstances," she replied, not looking up from her measuring tape. "Some neighbors feel that a fence this high creates an unwelcoming atmosphere." I watched her work, noting how she held her phone at angles that would make the fence appear larger than it actually was, how she positioned herself to capture my property in the most unflattering light possible. "Which neighbors?" she looked up. Then, and for just a moment, the mask slipped. I saw something cold and predatory in her eyes, the look of someone who enjoyed watching others squirm. "I'm not at liberty to share that information. Privacy concerns, you understand?" But I did understand. I understood perfectly. There were no complaints. There were no offended neighbors. There was only Karen Mitchell, manufacturing violations, to justify her campaign of harassment. "I'll need you to remove or modify this fence within 14 days, she continued, tucking her measuring tape back into her designer purse. "The notice will be in your mailbox tomorrow morning." She turned to leave, then paused at my gate. "Oh, and Jake? Next time I need to inspect your property, please make sure you're available to escort me. Some people might consider it rude to have guests wandering around unattended." She'd called herself a guest in my own backyard while trespassing. The violation notice arrived the next morning, just as promised. This one was different from the others, longer, more detailed, and written in language that bordered on legal jargon. She was escalating her tactics, trying to intimidate me with official-sounding bureaucracy. But the fence notice was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, Karen's campaign intensified with the precision of a military operation. Violation notices arrived with increasing frequency, each one more petty than the last. My trash cans were placed 12 inches from the approved location. My lawn sprinklers were creating excessive water runoff onto public sidewalks. My outdoor Lighting was allegedly too bright and disturbing to neighbors. Even my doormat, a simple black mat that said "Welcome," somehow violated the community aesthetic standards. Each violation came with photographic evidence, timestamps, and citations from the CCNRs that read like passages from a particularly boring legal textbook. Karen had turned harassment into an art form, complete with documentation that would make a forensic accountant weep with joy. But the most disturbing part wasn't the violations themselves. It was how she delivered them. Karen had started timing her visits to coincide with my daily routines. She'd appear at my door just as I was leaving for work, forcing me to either engage with her or appear rude by walking away. She'd position herself in her front yard during my evening runs, always finding reasons to call out corrections or concerns as I passed by. Most unnervingly, she'd begun taking photos of my house at different times of day, claiming she needed to document ongoing violations for her files. I'd spot her across the street with her phone, zooming in on my windows, my driveway, my garden, creating a visual record that felt more like surveillance than HOA enforcement. The psychological pressure was deliberate and effective. She was trying to make me feel watched, judged, and unwelcome in my own neighborhood. What she didn't know was that I was watching her, too. My surveillance equipment had been recording her activities for months, capturing a pattern of behavior that went far beyond zealous HOA enforcement. She was stalking me, plain and simple, and documenting it with the thorough precision of someone building a legal case. But Karen's greatest miscalculation was assuming I was an ordinary target. Most people crack under sustained psychological pressure. They move away, pay whatever fines are demanded, or simply surrender to avoid further conflict. Karen had perfected this technique over years of suburban warfare, using official authority to bully neighbors into submission. She'd never encountered someone with professional training in psychological resistance. Every violation notice went into my files. Every trespassing incident was recorded and time-stamped. Every interaction was analyzed for patterns and motivations. I was building a counter case with the methodical precision of someone who understood how predators operated. But Karen interpreted my compliance as weakness. Each time I paid a fine or corrected a violation, she saw validation for her tactics. She was winning in her mind, and winning meant she could push harder. The breaking point came on a Friday evening in October. I was working late at the task force office when my phone buzzed with a motion detection alert from my home security system. I pulled up the live feed and watched Karen Mitchell standing in my driveway, examining my truck with the intensity of a detective studying evidence. She walked around the vehicle slowly, taking photographs from every angle. Then she tried the door handles. When she found them locked, she peered through the windows, using her phone's flashlight to illuminate the interior. For 23 minutes, she conducted what could only be described as a surveillance operation on my vehicle, documenting details and searching for anything she could use against me. Then she noticed my security camera. Instead of looking embarrassed or backing away, she walked directly up to the camera and stared into the lens. For 30 full seconds, she stood there, her face illuminated by the infrared LEDs, wearing an expression of pure challenge. Then she smiled and walked away. That weekend, I found a new violation notice in my mailbox. This one was different from all the others. Dear Mr. Thompson, after extensive community consultation and property inspection, the HOA Board has determined that your vehicle presents ongoing concerns regarding community standards and safety. Effective immediately, you are required to relocate your truck to off-street parking or face daily fines of $100 until compliance is achieved. Please be advised that continued resistance to community standards may result in legal action and/or liens against your property. This is your final notice. Karen Mitchell. HOA president. She'd declared war. Not with careful bureaucracy or polite suburban passive aggression, but with an ultimatum that threatened my home itself. Karen Mitchell had spent months probing for weaknesses, testing my limits, and escalating her harassment campaign. She thought she'd found a target she could break through sustained psychological pressure and legal intimidation. What she'd actually found was someone who'd spent years studying bullies, predators, and criminals. Someone who understood exactly how to let them expose themselves completely before closing the trap. The final notice wasn't a threat. It was a confession. Karen Mitchell had just documented her intent to use official authority for personal harassment, creating a paper trail that would destroy her credibility and her power base. But she wasn't done yet. 3 weeks later, she picked up a baseball bat and turned my truck into her personal art project. That's when she learned the difference between picking on powerless neighbors and declaring war on someone who fought much more dangerous battles for a living. The student was about to become the teacher, and Karen Mitchell was about to get an education in consequences. She thought she was messing with a random neighbor. She had no clue my truck wasn't just a truck. It was government property. The morning after Karen's late-night artwork session, I stood in my driveway drinking coffee and watching the crime scene technicians photograph every scratch, every fragment of glass, every drop of spray paint that decorated what had once been Mobile Command Unit 7. "This is some personal shit," said Detective Rodriguez, my longtime partner, and the closest thing I had to a best friend in law enforcement. He was crouched next to the driver's side door, examining Karen's artistic message with professional interest. "Someone really wanted to send you a message." "Yeah? Well, they sent it to the wrong address," I replied, handing him the printed security footage I'd prepared. "Take a look at this." Rodriguez studied the photos, his eyebrows climbing higher with each image. "Holy shit, Jake. She documented her own crime. Look at this. She's posing for the camera like she's at a photo shoot. Gets better. Check out the note she left." He read Karen's monogrammed confession, shaking his head slowly. Signed her initials. On her personal stationery, while committing felony vandalism against state property. Some people make it easy. Rodriguez looked up from the photos, his expression shifting from amusement to something more serious. "You know what this means, right? This isn't just vandalism anymore. She damaged a law enforcement vehicle, tampered with surveillance equipment, and destroyed evidence storage compartments. That's federal territory." I nodded. I'd been thinking about that all morning. My truck might have looked like an ordinary F-150 to Karen Mitchell, but appearances were deceiving. What she'd attacked was a rolling command center worth more than most people's houses, equipped with technology that existed in a legal category entirely separate from civilian property. The surveillance package alone was worth $40,000. Encrypted radio systems, GPS tracking, evidence storage lockers, reinforced doors, bulletproof glass, every component was cataloged as state property and protected under laws that treated any interference as an attack on law enforcement itself. When Karen swung that baseball bat, she hadn't just vandalized a truck. She'd committed assault on a law enforcement officer's equipment, interference with police operations, and destruction of evidence storage systems. Each swing of the bat had added another federal charge to a list that was growing longer by the hour. "The question is," Rodriguez said, standing and dusting off his knees, "what do you want to do about it? We could have her in custody by lunch." I looked across the street at Karen's house. Her bedroom curtains twitched. She was watching, probably, wondering why there were so many official vehicles in my driveway. "Not yet," I said. "Not yet? Jake, she committed about 12 different felonies last night. Why wait? That was the question I'd been wrestling with since watching the security footage. I could end this immediately. One phone call, and Karen Mitchell's reign of suburban terror would be over. She'd be facing federal charges that would strip away her HOA authority and her freedom. But that would be too easy. Karen had spent 18 months making my life miserable through systematic harassment and psychological warfare. She'd used her position of authority to bully not just me, but dozens of neighbors who had no recourse against her abuse. A quick arrest would stop her, but it wouldn't undo the damage she'd caused or help the neighbors she'd victimized. More importantly, it wouldn't teach her the lesson she needed to learn about what happened when you picked on the wrong person. She doesn't know what she hit, I said. Look at her. She's probably planning her next move, thinking she taught me some kind of lesson. Rodriguez followed my gaze to Karen's house. So I want her to dig herself deeper. Let her think she's winning. Give her enough rope to hang herself with. That's playing with fire, partner. What if she escalates further? I smiled, thinking about the surveillance equipment, the documented evidence, and the legal framework that now surrounded Karen Mitchell like an invisible net. Let her escalate. Every move she makes now is another federal crime. Every harassment tactic is another charge. Every abuse of her HOA authority is more evidence for the prosecution. Rodriguez studied my face, recognizing the expression that appeared when I was building a case against someone who thought they were untouchable. You're going hunting. She's been hunting me for months. Time to turn the tables. Over the next few days, I put my plan into motion. First, I had the truck repaired through official channels, documenting every expense as destruction of state property. The bill came to $18,000, each dollar representing additional restitution Karen would eventually owe. Then I began setting traps. I planted small, harmless violations around my property. A garden hose left visible from the street. A trash can positioned 6 inches from the approved location. A doormat that might technically violate color restrictions. Each violation was carefully calculated to trigger Karen's compulsive need to document and punish. The response was immediate and predictable. Violation notices began arriving daily, each one more aggressive than the last. Karen was escalating. Her campaign, emboldened by what she perceived as her victory with the truck vandalism. But now I had context for her behavior. Every notice she sent was harassment under color of authority. Every trespass onto my property was criminal. Every photograph she took was surveillance. What had once been annoying HOA enforcement was now a federal case being built one violation notice at a time. I also began reaching out to other neighbors, quietly documenting their experiences with Karen's harassment. The stories were remarkably consistent. Petty violations, arbitrary fines, psychological pressure designed to force compliance or drive people away. Mrs. Chen had been fined repeatedly for her flower garden being too colorful. The Johnson family faced constant citations for their children's toys being visible from the street. Elderly Mr. Peterson had received threatening letters about his lawn height while recovering from surgery. Each story added another layer to the pattern of abuse Karen had been perpetrating for years, but the most valuable intelligence came from an unexpected source. Janet Walsh lived 3 houses down from me and had served on the HOA board until Karen consolidated power and forced out anyone who disagreed with her methods. Janet had been keeping her own files on Karen's activities, documenting financial irregularities and questionable decisions that bordered on corruption. She's been skimming money from the HOA treasury, Janet told me during a quiet conversation in my backyard. Fake violation fines, inflated contractor bills, unauthorized consulting fees. I tried to bring it up at a board meeting, and she had me removed for disruptive behavior. How much money are we talking about? At least 20,000 over. The past 2 years, maybe more. Karen Mitchell wasn't just a power-hungry bully. She was also a thief. That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing the evidence I'd accumulated. Security footage, violation notices, financial documents, witness statements. The case against Karen Mitchell was becoming comprehensive enough to fill multiple filing cabinets, but she still didn't know what she'd stepped in. From her perspective, she was winning. The harassment was working. The truck vandalism had sent the message she intended. She'd successfully demonstrated her power and my helplessness. That illusion of victory would be her downfall, because Karen Mitchell had made one. Crucial error in judgment. She'd assumed that her target was just another powerless neighbor who would eventually be broken by sustained pressure. She had no idea that her target was someone who'd spent years studying predators, building cases against criminals, and understanding exactly how to let suspects expose themselves completely before closing the trap. Every violation notice she sent was another piece of evidence. Every harassment tactic was another federal charge. Every abuse of her authority was another nail in the coffin she was building for herself. Karen thought she was teaching me about power. She was about to learn what real power looked like when it was wielded by someone who knew how to use it. The student was about to become the teacher, and class was almost in session. When you're on a task force, you never fight alone. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after the truck incident, when I was reviewing surveillance footage in my home office. I'd been studying patterns in Karen's behavior, tracking her movement around the neighborhood, documenting her harassment campaigns against multiple residents. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before. In the background of one video, barely visible in the corner of the frame, I caught a glimpse of another neighbor watching Karen's activities with intense interest. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m., late for casual observation. I enhanced the image and recognized the watcher, David Park, a quiet software engineer who lived 4 houses down. David kept to himself, maintained his property meticulously, and had never appeared on Karen's violation radar, but apparently David had been conducting his own surveillance operation. The next evening, I took a casual walk through the neighborhood, timing my route to intersect with David's usual evening jog. We'd nodded to each other countless times, but never actually spoken. "Evening," I said as he approached. "Evening," he replied, slowing to a stop. "Rough week with the truck situation." "You saw that?" David glanced around, then gestured toward a small park at the end of the street. "Walk with me?" We sat on a bench, overlooking a playground that hadn't seen children in months. Karen's noise ordinances had effectively banished families with young kids from using the common areas. "I've been watching," David said quietly. "Not just the truck thing. All of it. For about a year now." "Watching what exactly?" David pulled out his phone and showed me a folder containing dozens of photos and videos. Karen's activities. I started documenting after she tried to force me to remove my home security system. I scrolled through the files, my respect for David's thoroughness growing with each image. He'd captured Karen trespassing on multiple properties, photographing neighbors' homes at odd hours, going through people's trash, and conducting what could only be described as surveillance operations. "This is impressive work," I said. "I'm a software engineer. I know surveillance when I see it." David's voice carried a quiet intensity. "She's not just enforcing HOA rules, she's stalking people. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" I studied David's face in the dim park lighting. There was something different about him. a sharpness that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. "What makes you think I'm going to do anything?" David smiled for the first time since I'd known him. "Because you're not really just a neighbor, are you?" My hand instinctively moved toward where my badge would be. "What makes you say that?" "Your truck, for starters. I ran the VIN through some databases I probably shouldn't have access to. It's registered as government property. Law enforcement, specifically." I was quiet for a long moment, recalculating everything. David wasn't just a concerned neighbor. He was someone with serious technical skills and the knowledge to use them. "You could have led with that information," I said. "I could have. But I wanted to see how you were going to handle this. Karen Mitchell isn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She's running a systematic harassment and extortion operation. And now she's committed federal crimes against your property." David was right, and his intelligence gathering had filled in gaps I hadn't even realized existed. Over the next hour, he walked me through a comprehensive picture of Karen's activities that went far beyond what I'd documented. She'd been using her HOA position to run background checks on residents, accessing personal information she had no legal right to obtain. She'd been coordinating with certain local contractors to inflate repair estimates, then taking kickbacks when residents were forced to hire approved vendors. Most damaging of all, she'd been systematically targeting families with children, elderly residents, and single women, people she perceived as vulnerable. "The Hendersons," David said, showing me a file filled with violation notices. "Karen forced them to spend $12,000 on landscaping corrections last year. They ended up selling their house and moving away. The Nguyens got hit with 15 different violations in 1 month. Parking angles, mailbox positioning, garden height restrictions, all arbitrary measurements that changed depending on her mood. And Mrs. Patterson," David's voice grew harder, 83 years old, living on Social Security, and Karen was fining her $300 a month for lawn maintenance deficiencies while she was recovering from chemotherapy. Each story added weight to the case I was building, but more importantly, they revealed the scope of Karen's operation. This wasn't random harassment. It was a calculated system designed to extract money and assert control over vulnerable residents. "There's more," David said, pulling out a tablet. "Financial records." What he showed me made my blood run cold. David had somehow accessed Karen's personal banking information and cross-referenced it with HOA financial statements. The pattern was unmistakable. Money flowing from HOA accounts into Karen's personal finances through a network of shell companies and fake vendor arrangements. "How did you get this information?" David's smile was enigmatic. "Let's just say my day job involves network security. Sometimes I test systems to make sure they're properly protected. And Karen's systems weren't properly protected?" Karen's systems were Swiss cheese. Her password for everything was Maple Grove Huantuint, including her banking and investment accounts. I stared at the financial data, understanding the implications. Karen wasn't just a bully. She was stealing from the very residents she was supposed to serve, using harassment tactics to generate fake violations that fed money into her personal accounts. How long has this been going on? Based on the records, at least 3 years. She's stolen over $60,000 from the HOA, and probably another $40,000 in fraudulent fines and vendor kickbacks. The scope of Karen's criminal enterprise was staggering. What I'd thought was personal harassment against me was actually just one small part of a much larger operation. "Why haven't you gone to the police?" David was quiet for a moment. "Because going to the local police means dealing with bureaucracy, jurisdictional issues, and the possibility that Karen has connections I don't know about. She's been operating this scam for years. She must have some kind of protection or political influence. But federal law enforcement operates differently. They don't care about local politics or HOA authority. They only care about federal crimes and financial fraud. David had done more than gather intelligence. He'd analyzed the situation strategically and identified the most effective approach to bringing Karen down. "There's something else," he said. "I'm not the only one who's been watching. Janet Walsh has been documenting financial irregularities. Mrs. Chen has been keeping copies of every violation notice and taking photos of the arbitrary measurements Karen uses. Even old Mr. Peterson has security cameras now." How many people are we talking about? 12 households at least. Everyone who's been targeted by Karen's harassment campaigns. We've been sharing information quietly, building our own files. I realized I wasn't just dealing with one concerned neighbor. I was looking at an organized resistance movement that had been operating under Karen's radar for months. "What do you need from me?" David asked. "Access to everything you've gathered. Financial records, surveillance footage, documentation of harassment patterns, and I need to meet with the other neighbors." "That can be arranged. But Jake—" David's expression grew serious. "Karen's getting more aggressive. The truck vandalism wasn't random. It was escalation. She's feeling pressure from somewhere, and desperate people make dangerous decisions." As if summoned by our conversation, the sound of heels on pavement echoed through the quiet park. We looked up to see Karen Mitchell walking her small dog along the path, moving with the deliberate pace of someone conducting surveillance rather than casual exercise. She spotted us on the bench and changed direction, approaching with her practiced smile. "Good evening, gentlemen," she called out. "Lovely night for a chat in the park." "Evening, Karen," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. She let her dog sniff around the bench while her eyes scanned our faces, clearly trying to determine what we'd been discussing. "I hope you're both staying current with your community obligations," she said, her voice carrying that familiar edge of implied threat. "We've had some compliance issues lately that required firm responses." "Everything's up to date," David said quietly. Karen's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary. "I'm sure it is. David's always been very careful about following rules. There was something in her tone that suggested she knew more about David's activities than she was letting on. "Well," she said, tugging her dog's leash, "I should continue my evening walk. So many things to observe in our lovely neighborhood." She walked away, but I noticed she'd positioned her phone in a way that could have been recording our conversation. "She knows," David said quietly. "Knows what?" "That we're organizing against her. The way she looked at me, she suspects something." I watched Karen disappear around a corner, her dog trotting obediently beside her. "Then we need to move faster." Over the next few days, David arranged meetings with other neighbors who'd been documenting Karen's activities. What I discovered was a neighborhood full of people who'd been living under siege, quietly gathering evidence while hoping someone would eventually take action. Janet Walsh had financial records dating back 2 years. Mrs. Chen had photographs showing Karen's arbitrary measurement techniques. The Johnson family had recorded audio of Karen's threats during a heated confrontation about their children's toys. Most significantly, Martha Peterson, Mr. Peterson's daughter and a retired paralegal, had been building a legal case based on civil rights violations and elder abuse. She targeted my father specifically because of his age and health condition, Martha explained during a meeting in Janet's living room. The harassment intensified after his surgery, like she was testing, to see if he was too weak to fight back. The picture that emerged was of a systematic predator who used official authority to target vulnerable residents, extract money through fraudulent violations, and maintain power through intimidation. But we had something Karen didn't know about: coordination, documentation, and access to federal law enforcement resources. "Here's what's going to happen," I told the group. "We're going to let Karen continue digging her own grave while we compile everything into a comprehensive case: financial fraud, harassment under color of authority, civil rights violations, theft from the HOA Treasury. By the time we're done, she'll be facing enough federal charges to put her away for decades." "What if she escalates further?" asked Mrs. Chen. I smiled, thinking about the surveillance equipment, the legal framework, and the team of federal prosecutors who specialized in public corruption cases. "Let her escalate. Every move she makes now is another federal crime. We're not just fighting back against one bully. We're building a case that will end her operation permanently and help everyone she's victimized." For the first time in months, I saw hope in my neighbors' faces. They'd been fighting alone, documenting abuses while feeling powerless to stop them. But they weren't alone anymore. Karen Mitchell had picked the wrong neighborhood to terrorize, and her education in consequences was about to begin. Sometimes justice isn't about charging in. It's about letting the villain write their own confession. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in November, held in the community center that Karen had transformed into her personal courtroom over the past 3 years. Normally, these meetings drew maybe 6 or 7 residents who sat in uncomfortable silence, while Karen held court over architectural violations and landscaping infractions. This time would be different. I arrived early, taking a seat in the back row with a clear view of the entire room. My phone was recording, my surveillance equipment was activated, and a federal prosecutor was on standby, waiting for the evidence I was about to gather. One by one, my neighbors began filing in. David Park, carrying a laptop and a folder of documents. Janet Walsh, with her financial records. Mrs. Chen, the Johnson family. Martha Peterson. Nearly 20 residents total, filling the small meeting room with an energy Karen had never encountered before. She entered at exactly 7 o'clock, wearing a navy blazer and carrying her official HOA binder like a shield. Her eyes scanned the unexpectedly large crowd with obvious surprise, but her politician's smile never wavered. "How wonderful to see such community engagement," she said, taking her position at the front table. "I hope this means more residents are ready to embrace our community standards." I watched her settle into her routine, arranging papers and checking her phone with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced organized opposition. She had no idea she was about to walk into a trap that had been months in the making. "First, order of business," Karen began, consulting her notes. "Ongoing violations and enforcement actions." She started with the usual targets: lawn height infractions, parking violations, mailbox positioning errors. Each violation was presented with photographs, measurements, and citations from the community covenants. Her tone was professional, authoritative, and completely oblivious to the mood shift in the room. "Mr. Thompson," she said, finally reaching my name on her list. "We need to discuss your continued non-compliance with community parking standards." I remained seated, letting her continue. "Despite multiple notices and a final warning, your oversized vehicle continues to present aesthetic and safety concerns to our community." She pulled out a fresh set of photographs, my truck from various angles, including close-ups that emphasized its size and commercial appearance. "Furthermore," Karen continued, her voice growing stronger as she warmed to her subject, "recent incidents have demonstrated the disruptive nature of this vehicle and its owner's disregard for community harmony." Several neighbors glanced at me, recognizing that Karen was about to publicly discuss the vandalism incident. On the night of October 15th, This vehicle was involved in an incident that required community intervention to address ongoing violation of parking and aesthetic standards. I felt David tense beside me. Karen was actually going to admit to the vandalism in a public forum, with witnesses and recording equipment capturing every word. "Sometimes," Karen said, her smile taking on a sharp edge, "direct action is necessary when normal enforcement procedures fail to achieve compliance." She was confessing. In front of 20 witnesses, while being recorded. I stood up slowly, and the room went quiet. "Karen, are you saying you were involved in damaging my truck?" Her smile faltered for just a moment, but her arrogance quickly reasserted itself. "I'm saying that some people need stronger motivation to understand community standards." "So you admit you vandalized my vehicle?" The room was dead silent now. Karen looked around at the faces staring at her, suddenly realizing she might have said more than intended. "I admit nothing," she said quickly. "But hypothetically speaking, if someone were to take action to protect community property values, that would be understandable." "Hypothetically?" Karen's composure was cracking. "This meeting is about community business, not your personal complaints. About accountability." That's when Janet Walsh stood up. "Speaking of accountability," Janet said, opening her folder, "I'd like to discuss some financial irregularities in the HOA Treasury." Karen's face went white. "That's not on tonight's agenda. According to our bylaws, any board member can raise financial concerns at any meeting," Janet continued. "And these concerns are significant." David Park opened his laptop and connected it to the room's projection system. Financial spreadsheets filled the wall screen. Bank statements, vendor payments, mysterious transfers that couldn't be accounted for. "Over the past 3 years," Janet said, "approximately $60,000 has disappeared from HOA accounts through fraudulent vendor payments, inflated maintenance contracts, and fake violation fines." Karen stood abruptly. "This is highly irregular. I'm ending this meeting." "No, you're not," said Mrs. Chen, rising from her seat. "We have questions about these violation fines you've been collecting." More neighbors stood up. Martha Peterson, the Johnson family. Families I'd never seen at HOA meetings before. Karen looked around the room with growing alarm as she realized she was surrounded by organized opposition for the first time in her reign. "Furthermore," I said, pulling out my badge and placing it on the table where everyone could see it, "as a member of the State Police Task Force, I'm officially documenting tonight's proceedings as evidence in an ongoing federal investigation." The room erupted. Gasps, whispered conversations, and the sound of phones being pulled out to capture the moment. Karen stared at my badge as if it were a snake that had suddenly appeared on the table. "You're," she stammered, "a state police officer. The truck you vandalized wasn't my personal vehicle. It was an unmarked law enforcement unit worth $40,000 in specialized equipment." Karen sat down heavily, her face cycling through shock, fear, and calculation as the implications hit her. "Every violation notice you sent me was harassment under color of authority," I continued. "Every time you trespassed on my property was criminal. Every fraudulent fine was theft. And every dollar you stole from the HOA treasury was embezzlement." David's laptop display switched to surveillance footage, Karen conducting her midnight vandalism session, complete with her theatrical reveal to the security camera and her careful documentation of the damage. "We have video evidence, financial records, witness testimony, and your own admission from tonight's meeting," I said. "The federal prosecutor reviewing this case estimates you're facing between 15 and 20 years in federal prison." Karen looked around the room desperately, searching for allies who weren't there. Every face stared back at her with years of suppressed anger finally finding an outlet. "This is entrapment," she said weakly. "No, this is consequences." The meeting devolved into chaos as neighbors began sharing their own stories of Karen's harassment and abuse. Years of suppressed anger spilled out in a torrent of testimonies that painted a picture of systematic bullying and financial corruption. Karen tried to leave, but Martha Peterson blocked the door. "I don't think so," Martha said. "You made my father's life hell while he was recovering from surgery. You're going to sit here and listen to every story." For the next hour, Karen was forced to endure a catalog of her victims' experiences. Each story was more damaging than the last, creating a public record of abuse that would follow her for years. Finally, I stood up again. The federal investigation is ongoing, but I can tell you that criminal charges will be filed within the week. Karen Mitchell, you're under arrest for vandalism of federal property, harassment under color of authority, theft, and embezzlement. I read her rights while David filmed the entire arrest. Her careful composure completely shattered as handcuffs clicked around her wrists, the same hands that had swung a baseball bat at my truck 6 weeks earlier. "You can't do this," she said, as I led her toward the door. "I'm the HOA president. I have authority here." "Your authority ended the moment you committed federal crimes," I replied, "and your presidency ends tonight." As we walked through the IE Community Center doors, Karen looked back at the crowd of neighbors she'd terrorized for years. They watched her departure in complete silence, not celebrating, but finally seeing justice served. The woman who'd ruled through fear and intimidation was being led away in handcuffs, her power broken, and her crimes exposed for everyone to see. Karen Mitchell had spent months trying to teach me about power and control. Instead, she'd learned that real power comes from serving justice, not abusing authority. And her lesson was just beginning. It wasn't me who exposed her. It was her own arrogance under the brightest lights. 3 days after Karen's arrest, the story hit the local news with the force of a sledgehammer through suburban complacency. HOA president, arrested for vandalizing police vehicle, ran as the lead story on Channel 7's evening broadcast, complete with security footage of Karen's midnight vandalism session and interviews with neighbors who'd suffered under her reign. But Karen Mitchell wasn't going down quietly. She posted bail within hours and immediately launched a media counterattack, claiming she was the victim of a police conspiracy designed to silence her legitimate HOA enforcement activities. She appeared on local talk radio, gave interviews to sympathetic bloggers, and hired a public relations firm to spin her arrest as government overreach against property rights. This is what happens when law enforcement officers can't handle civilian oversight, she told Channel 12 News, standing in front of her perfectly manicured lawn, like a politician at a campaign rally. "I was protecting our community's property values, and now I'm being persecuted for doing my job." The counterattack might have worked if Karen had stayed quiet and let her lawyers handle the case. But Karen Mitchell had never learned when to stop talking. The breaking point came during the emergency HOA meeting called to address her removal from the board. The community center was packed beyond capacity, with local news crews setting up cameras and reporters interviewing neighbors about their experiences. Karen arrived with her attorney and a defiant attitude that suggested she still believed she could salvage her reputation through sheer force of personality. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced from the front of the room, "I'm here tonight to address the malicious allegations that have been made against me by a rogue police officer who couldn't handle proper community oversight." The crowd shifted restlessly. After years of enforced silence during Karen's meetings, residents weren't used to hearing her challenged publicly. Mr. Thompson has used his law enforcement connections to fabricate charges against me because I dared to hold him accountable for community standards violations, Karen continued, her voice rising with practiced indignation. This is abuse of power at its worst. I remained seated in the back, letting her build her own funeral pyre. Furthermore, Karen said, warming to her theme, I want everyone to understand that every action I took was in service to this community. Every violation notice, every fine, every enforcement action was designed to protect your property values and maintain the standards that make Maple Grove special. Janet Walsh stood up, holding a thick folder. Karen, are you saying the $60,000 you embezzled was also protecting our property values? Karen's lawyer whispered urgently in her ear, but she waved him off. Those are accounting errors being blown out of proportion by people who don't understand HOA financial management. Accounting errors? David Park had connected his laptop to the projection system again, displaying bank statements that showed clear patterns of theft. These are systematic transfers from HOA accounts to your personal finances. The crowd murmured as the financial evidence filled the screen. Karen looked at the projections with growing alarm, realizing her crimes were being displayed for everyone to see. That presentation is based on illegally obtained information, she said desperately. Mr. Park hacked into private financial records. Actually, David replied calmly, I used the password Maple Grove 100D123 that you used for everything, including your banking accounts. Not exactly high-security hacking. The crowd erupted in laughter. Karen's face flushed red as she realized she'd just admitted to using the same password for all her accounts. The point is, Karen said, trying to regain control, every action I took was legal and necessary, including addressing Mr. Thompson's oversized vehicle that violated our community aesthetics. That's when I stood up and walked to the front of the room. Karen, I said quietly, are you sure you want to continue this line of defense? I'm not afraid of you or your badges or your government intimidation tactics, she replied, her voice carrying across the packed room. I did what needed to be done to protect this community, including vandalizing my truck with a baseball bat. That vehicle was an eyesore that violated multiple community standards. If hypothetical direct action was necessary to address ongoing violations, then hypothetically, that would be justified community service. Her attorney was frantically trying to get her attention, but Karen was beyond listening to legal advice. Years of unchallenged authority had convinced her she could talk her way out of any situation. So you admit you vandalized my truck? I admit that someone needed to take action when normal enforcement procedures failed. The truck that belonged to the State Police Task Force? Karen hesitated for the first time. That's not relevant. It's very relevant. You didn't just vandalize a neighbor's vehicle. You destroyed federal property, tampered with law enforcement equipment, and interfered with police operations. I pulled out photos of the damage, projecting them onto the wall screen. The crowd gasped at the images of shattered glass, spray-painted threats, and deliberate destruction. $18,000 in damage to surveillance equipment, encrypted communication systems, and evidence storage compartments, I continued. Each component protected under federal law. Karen looked around the room, finally sensing that her audience was turning against her. This is a setup. You're trying to make me look like a criminal when I was protecting our community. You are a criminal, Karen. You're facing federal charges for vandalism, theft, harassment, and embezzlement. The evidence is overwhelming, and your confessions tonight have been recorded by multiple news outlets. That's when the room exploded. Neighbors, who'd stayed silent for years, began shouting their own stories of Karen's abuse. Mrs. Chen described the racist comments Karen had made about her garden. The Johnson family detailed threats against their children. Mr. Peterson's daughter read a statement about the harassment campaign against her elderly father during his cancer recovery. Karen tried to respond to each accusation, but her explanations only made things worse. Every defense contained admissions of additional misconduct. Every justification revealed new depths of abuse. The local news cameras captured everything: Karen's meltdown, the neighbors' testimonies, and the complete destruction of her public reputation in real time. "This is persecution," Karen finally screamed over the crowd. "I was protecting property values. I was maintaining community standards. I was doing my job." "Your job was never to terrorize your neighbors," I replied. "Your job was never to steal money from the HOA treasury. And your job was definitely never to vandalize law enforcement vehicles." Karen looked around the room one last time, seeing nothing but angry faces and recording devices. Her perfect suburban kingdom had collapsed, her authority was gone, and her crimes were being broadcast to the entire city. "You people don't deserve what I did for this community," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't appreciate the sacrifices I made to maintain our standards. The only thing you sacrificed was your integrity," Janet Walsh called out, "and our trust, and $60,000 of our money." Karen's attorney finally succeeded in pulling her toward the exit, but the damage was done. She'd publicly confessed to multiple crimes while demonstrating the arrogance and lack of remorse that would influence her sentencing. As the community center doors closed behind her, the room erupted in applause. Not celebration, but relief. For the first time in years, neighbors felt free to speak without fear of retaliation. The news footage that aired that evening showed Karen Mitchell's complete public meltdown, her confessions to federal crimes, and the community's testimony. About years of harassment and abuse, by morning the story had gone viral. HOA Karen was trending on social media, with millions of people sharing the video of her arrest and her disastrous public statements. Karen Mitchell had wanted to make an example of me. Instead, she'd made an example of herself. A cautionary tale about what happened when petty authority was corrupted by arrogance and greed. Her education in consequences was complete, but justice still had one more lesson to teach. When the dust settled, the glass was still in my driveway, but the neighborhood felt cleaner than it had in years. 6 months after Karen's public meltdown, I stood in my driveway, watching a landscaping crew remove the concrete barriers she'd installed around the community park for safety reasons. The barriers had actually been designed to prevent children from playing, another layer of control in her comprehensive system of neighborhood oppression. The federal case against Karen Mitchell had proceeded with the methodical precision of a freight train. 23 felony counts, including vandalism of federal property, embezzlement, harassment under color of authority, mail fraud, and wire fraud. Her public confessions and social media meltdown had provided prosecutors with evidence they usually only dreamed about. She'd initially tried to maintain her innocence, claiming she was a victim of police harassment and government overreach. But the evidence was overwhelming, and her own recorded statements had demolished any hope of mounting a successful defense. The financial investigation had revealed even more corruption than we'd initially discovered. Karen had been running essentially a protection racket, using her HOA authority to extract money from residents through fraudulent violations, inflated maintenance contracts, and outright theft from community funds. The total amount of money she'd stolen came to over $90,000, enough to qualify for enhanced federal sentences, that would keep her in prison for years. But the most satisfying part of Karen's downfall wasn't the prison sentence. It was watching the community heal. Without Karen's reign of terror, Maple Grove had transformed into an actual neighborhood. Children played in the streets again. Neighbors talked to each other without fear of HOA retaliation. People planted gardens, painted their houses in colors they actually liked, and parked their cars without measuring angles with rulers. Janet Walsh had been elected as the new HOA president in a unanimous vote, running on a platform of returning the organization to its original purpose, maintaining common areas and organizing community events instead of terrorizing residents with arbitrary violations. The first community meeting under Janet's leadership had drawn over 40 residents, more than Karen's meetings had ever attracted. Instead of sitting in fearful silence, neighbors actually participated in discussions about playground improvements, holiday decorations, and block party planning. "It's like the whole neighborhood can breathe again," Mrs. Chen told me during a chance encounter at the mailbox. "My grandchildren want to visit now that they can actually play outside." The financial recovery had been equally dramatic. The money Karen stole was being returned through restitution payments and asset forfeiture. But more importantly, the fraudulent fines and violations were being refunded to families who'd been victimized by her schemes. The Hendersons, who'd been forced to sell their house and move away, received a check for $12,000. Full restitution for the landscaping corrections Karen had forced them to make. Mr. Peterson got back every penny of the fraudulent fines Karen had levied during his cancer recovery. But the most meaningful change was psychological. People who'd lived in fear of arbitrary punishment for years were learning to feel safe in their own neighborhood again. David Park had become something of a local hero, his technical skills and surveillance work having provided crucial evidence in Karen's prosecution. He'd also been elected to the HOA board, where his background in security systems was being used to actually protect the community instead of spying on it. The irony, David told me during one of our evening walks, is that Karen created the very resistance movement that brought her down. If she'd just been a normal HOA president, none of this would have happened. He was right. Karen's systematic harassment had forced her victims to organize, document, and coordinate their defense. By trying to crush all opposition, she'd created the evidence trail that enabled her prosecution. The federal sentencing hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in spring. I attended as both victim and investigating officer, sitting in the gallery with several neighbors who wanted to witness the conclusion of Karen's reign. Karen appeared in an orange jumpsuit, her perfect suburban armor replaced by the uniform of the incarcerated. Her lawyer made the usual arguments about character and community service, but the judge had read the case files and wasn't impressed. "Ms. Mitchell," the judge said, reviewing the sentencing documents, "you held a position of trust in your community and used that authority to systematically victimize your neighbors. You stole money, harassed families, and committed federal crimes against law enforcement personnel. Furthermore, your complete lack of remorse and your attempts to justify criminal behavior demonstrate that you still don't understand the severity of your actions." The judge sentenced Karen to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and full restitution to her victims. As she was led away in shackles, Karen looked back at the gallery where her former neighbors sat watching. For the first time since I'd known her, she appeared genuinely defeated. That evening, the neighborhood held an impromptu block party in the community park. Families brought grills and folding chairs. Children played games that would have been prohibited under Karen's noise ordinances, and people actually enjoyed each other's company without fear of violation notices. I stood at the edge of the festivities, watching kids chase fireflies while their parents laughed and talked, without the constant underlying tension that had defined neighborhood interactions for years. "Hard to believe it's the same place," Rodriguez said, joining me with a beer and his own family in tow. His kids immediately ran off to join the other children, adding their voices to the happy chaos. Funny how removing one toxic person can transform an entire community. I nodded, thinking about the lesson Karen had inadvertently taught everyone. Power without accountability inevitably corrupts, but communities have more strength than individual bullies realize when they finally decide to work together. The security cameras that had once captured Karen's crimes now recorded children playing, neighbors helping each other with yard work, and families enjoying the common spaces that had been designed for community enjoyment. "You think she learned anything?" Rodriguez asked. I watched the sun set over a neighborhood that was finally at peace, thinking about Karen Mitchell sitting in a federal prison cell, probably still convinced she was the victim in this story. "Some people never learn," I said. "But sometimes that's okay. The important thing is that everyone else learned what happens when you let bullies go unchecked." The block party continued until well after dark, with conversations and laughter replacing the fearful silence that had once characterized evening hours in Maple Grove. Children played games their parents had been afraid to let them enjoy. Neighbors shared stories and made plans without worrying about HOA retaliation. For the first time in years, the community felt like a community. As I walked back to my house, I noticed something that made me smile. My truck was parked in my driveway, not perfectly aligned according to some arbitrary standard, just parked like a normal person's vehicle in a normal neighborhood. The glass had been swept up months ago, but the real damage had taken longer to repair. Trust had to be rebuilt. Fear had to be overcome. People had to remember what it felt like to live without constant supervision and arbitrary punishment. But they were remembering. And Karen Mitchell, despite her best efforts to control and terrorize her neighbors, had inadvertently taught everyone the most important lesson of all: that communities are stronger than the bullies who try to dominate them, and that justice, while sometimes slow, eventually finds its way to those who abuse their power. The neighborhood was healing, the victims were whole again, and the predator was behind bars where she belonged. Sometimes, that's exactly how justice is supposed to work. Power belongs to those who protect, not those who prey. And everyone in Maple Grove had finally learned the difference.